Okay. Thanks everyone for sticking with us. Late part of the conference, numbers tend to go down a little bit, but I'm glad to see that hasn't happened too much. A few more people might filter in. As you may have seen on the schedule, this is kind of 30-minute chat that we're going to have to kind of discuss new development for GNET. So last year, for those of you who attended, you might remember we announced a merger with another pre-existing project in READ, the database of primary extremist, right-wing extremist materials that has grown and become a very important resource for researchers, law enforcement, and tech and government policy folks. So I'm glad to say that we're still expanding as a project and growing and finding other partners who are doing really important work that we can help plug into our own set of resources and network. So you may have, if you on our email list, you would have seen a few weeks ago that we announced the addition of a new member of the GNET portfolio, I suppose, or family, if I want to be less formal, which is Extremism in Gaming Research Network, EGRN. So I wanted to go through a bit, sort of the reason why we wanted to do this, why it made sense for both of us, and then we'll talk a bit more about what EGRN does and why it's important, what it's done in the past, what it's doing now, and what it will do in the future. But integrating EGRN into GNET kind of reflects the reality of current trends in tech, extremism, terrorism, that we want to stay on top of and evolve alongside with. And that's that it's sort of this exploitation of technology, as has become clear during this conference and for anybody following this. It's no longer confined to the conventional platforms. Gaming ecosystems in particular, live stream cultures, immersive environments, these are all now central to understanding how extremists are adapting, are recruiting, communicating, and also evading moderation and detection, which I think is one of the key things that we see the use of gaming platforms for. So to that end, EGRN was kind of built, or has built, this sort of dedicated research community focused on understanding this issue. While GNET, as many of you already know, has developed this broad infrastructure of research infrastructure of evidence-based research on extremist use of technology, policy engagement, and also cross-sector convening. So it made a lot of sense for us to bring those two things together. It provides us both with this stronger, more coherent platform for understanding how extremists exploit technology across the full digital stack. So our discussion, as I noted, is kind of intended to both bring this to the attention of the research and policy community, for those of you who hadn't known it, and discuss the EGRN program, again, past, present, and future. To help me do that, I have Jacob Davey, who is with ISD, but also an EGRN member, and Dr. Aaron Saltman, you've already heard from, who will, after Jacob gives us an overview of EGRN, will give us the wider industry-facing perspective on this issue, and then we'll go from there. Thanks.
Let's try this. Round two. Great. I mean, I feel somewhat self-indulgent this afternoon. Whilst the other speakers today have been presenting some really phenomenal, fascinating, novel research, I get the pleasure to take a trip down memory lane for a couple of minutes. And really, I just want to tell you a little bit about the story of the EGRN, where we've come from and where we're going. So 5 years ago, when the Extremism in Gaming Research Network really was founded, sector working to counter extremism and terrorism had spent a decade plus generating a really significant evidence base of the ways terrorists and violent extremists use the internet. In particular, we had developed, I think, a pretty deep understanding of the role social media played in recruitment and radicalization, the impact that online communities were having on the shapes and structures of extremist movements, and indeed how all of this cascaded into terrorist operations and practice. However, I would say at a sector-wide level, it was perhaps less well understood the role gaming platforms played in this, how extremist movements and terrorists used video games, used online gaming, and how this was situated in the broader information ecosystem where these myriad movements all swam. Erin, I think it's also probably fair to say that there were some stakeholders with our work who still thought of gaming as a fringe pursuit, like something which is kept in dank and dingy teenage bedrooms. However, there was a nascent community of analysts who knew this wasn't the case. So the Gamergate harassment campaign in 2014 had shown us how certain fringes of the gaming community represented a really powerful force for the mainstreaming and the advancement of hateful and extremist worldviews to ever-increasing audiences. We had seen how ISIS and white supremacist movements had adopted gaming aesthetics into their messaging to make their violence more accessible. And we'd seen how gaming adjacent platforms like Discord and Twitch were becoming a really important part of the way violent extremists plotted and broadcasted their attacks. We also knew that gaming wasn't fringe. We knew that there were billions of gamers globally. We knew that gaming was more profitable than any other entertainment medium, outstripping movies, outstripping music. And so, as analysts, and I was one of these analysts at ISD, we were looking primarily at Discord, but there were others like Linda Schlegel, who was looking at gamification. And we sort of, as analysts, came together, and as we do, we started to talk, we started to share insights, we started to collaborate, and this sort of formed a loose community of practice. And in 2021, we decided to formalize this into the Extremism and Gaming Research Network. So a small handful of organizations, so Brucey, who very generously organized the network in its early years, GNET, ISD, Love Frankie, Modus, Moonshot, and others kind of came together into a voluntary network. And the plan was really to bring together a broad cohort of analysts, practitioners, and policymakers together to understand gaming-related harms and to start to generate responses to this. We did this through 4 pillars of work. So primarily, we convened. We had regular meetings together throughout the network, which connected members to each other, which fostered this community of practice and allowed it to grow. We generated a significant body of research into how games and gaming platforms were used and leveraged by extremists. We trained regulators, law enforcement, and practitioners on the phenomena, and we advised on interventions, so how to empower the gaming sector and civil society to push back against this phenomenon. And 5 years on, it's a fairly ambitious program of work, but I'm really pleased to say that the EGRN has achieved a great deal. When we launched in 2021, we established a set of research priorities, many of which have now been met. We've grown from that small handful of organizations into a network of well over 150 members who are regularly briefing out into policymakers. And I say this modestly, I think probably become the leading source of expertise globally on extremism, terrorism, and gaming. In terms of where we're going, something I'm very excited to talk about now is the work a few EGRN members are doing on interventions. This includes ISD. This is under the umbrella of something called Project Catalyst, which is an 18-month-led consortium project under the Christchurch Call Foundation, which is really looking to generate responses to online misogyny and gender-based violence. So under this umbrella, members are now really starting to innovate in terms of how we can push back against these phenomena and against these threats. This includes the generation of a curriculum for teachers and parents to help them understand and respond to gaming-related harms. I actually used an early version of this to help train teachers at a London primary school where a young boy had been radicalized on Roblox. So, actually really putting this into practice. At ISD, we're really excited to also be generating a series of interventions working with streamers to use them as accessible voices to help push back against online abuse. And there's sort of similar initiatives taking place through organizations like Peril. I'm incredibly proud of what the EGRN has achieved. I'm really excited about what we're going to go on to achieve. And I would say that this work is as important as it's ever been, perhaps more important than it's ever been. Just a couple of weeks ago, the attack on the mosque in San Diego was live streamed on Discord, okay, the gaming adjacent platform. Just last week, an American streamer who has an audience of millions of people globally publicly advocated to put peaceful protesters in work camps. Okay, this is the platform which gaming influencers can have. We know a significant majority of gamers on the receiving end of hate speech. We now know that there are more gamers now than there have ever been. Over 3.5 billion people on the planet are gaming. So it represents an incredibly important cultural touch point, not just for extremists, but for those of us who wish to push back. And I just say thank you for humoring me on my walk down memory lane.
Yeah, so Aaron, I think will be useful, I suppose, from the industry perspective to understand why do you think, or is the gaming platform issue kind of a key part of countering extremist use of technology? If so, what kind of forms does that take that concern you the most, and what have you seen that is being done about it?
Well, I mean, first of all, raise your hand if you consider yourself a gamer. Anyone self-identify? So there's about half actually in the room. I think it's important to state that we always start with the facts, which are just because you play games, even if you play extremely violent games, that does not make you more likely to be a violent extremist or terrorist. So the data is not positive that gaming is naturally inherently hate-based or extremist or evil. And some of the countries that play the most violent games at the highest rate have some of the lowest crime and terrorist rates necessarily in Asia and other parts of the world. So we start with some rationality of, we're not saying just because you make games or a gaming platform, you're inherently linked to terrorism or violent extremism, but with such a growing base of users, and if you have terrorist and violent extremists, they are adaptive and adversarial. And if they are looking to get a hold of certain types of audiences or younger audiences, they will go where those audiences are. And gaming can also be an easy way to segment audiences and create in-groups. If you look at multiplayer games, how to kind of co-opt and bring people together, starting with a commonality of gameplay and then redirecting them into other groups. So we haven't seen gaming in itself, one game completely radicalizing start to finish, but just like we've talked throughout the day, it's part of a user journey potentially, either usually as the starting point or gaming adjacent platforms being exploited for purposes that they weren't already being used for. And our goal is GIFCT, the reason why we fund an academic wing, which not every NGO has, we're so lucky to do that, is to strengthen the research capacity, to look at the ground truth of the trends, to understand gaming and online subcultures, to really look at the facts of what type of exploitation takes place. What are we saying is icky, in which case it's really hard to draw a policy line on ick. That's not a strong policy stance. There's a lot of lawful but awful content out there. And where can we say, actually, no, that is not just icky, that is an indicator of an in-group that has a violent extremist hate-based identity that is co-opting young people outside of their normal network and bringing them into these other spaces. I think the important thing is, since the beginning of EGRN, and raise your hand if you're part of EGRN or have attended an EGRN meeting. Okay, so there's maybe a quarter. So the other quarter that were gamers but aren't in EGRN yet, come on board. You could come and join in and have some fun. I think the point is that we want the feedback loop between the platforms that researchers are saying, hey, we see there's a problem, and there's researchers are always saying there's a gap between what they're finding and being able to communicate with the platforms. And so we are here to try to bridge that gap. I mean, if we talk about gaming platforms, our membership wise, we are working directly with Niantic, Roblox, Xbox, and Minecraft, the latter two through Microsoft. If we're talking about gaming adjacent platforms, we've got Discord and Twitch, but also TikTok and YouTube that are used as gaming and streaming sites. And if we talk about some future threats and we're worried about people actually using AI tools to develop gameplay or augment in gameplay world building using AI, we have, Anthropic, Gemini, Llama all at the table. And having a feedback loop where EGRN has been contributing insights to GNET for many years now. Anytime a member we work with is mentioned, we actually give them an embargoed copy of that insight, which is a lot of work between GNET and GIFCT to say, hey, this is what an author is saying. Now, companies aren't allowed to kibosh that insight, but they are allowed to course correct if they say, actually, there's an inaccuracy in how this is reflected. But they're also offered a chance for a conversation with the researcher so that they can bridge the gap and understand the trends and ask the questions like, well, how did you know that this was a nihilistic violent extremist network? Or what indicator led you to believe that that player was in fact affiliated with an Islamist extremist jihadist group or a neo-Nazi group, so that we understand the signals and we don't just leave it. The worst is when you leave research at the point of, that's horrible. And then when we go, what are we going to do about it? There's no pathway forward. What we're trying to do is make sure that the research trends then turn into actions. And for the last 3 years, we've been also having working groups that are multi-stakeholder that have brought EGRN into the table with GNET authors and with the tech companies for really strategic outputs to help tech companies do better in this space. So in 2024, we actually had a gaming community of practice. EGRN helped build out their library of research on gaming and extremism. I checked just earlier today, there's about 180 pieces of research that have been written in the last 10 years, a lot in the last 5. So if you're like, I don't know about gaming and extremism, there's your bedtime reading list, 180 articles long, a lot of which are GNET insights. But there's also things like breaking apart what threat surfaces are actually exploitative. So if you're just playing Mario Kart and it's just you in the game, no harm. Thank you, Mario. Great, good work. Anything that allows you to name a character, anything that allows you to mod your character and add features or world build, and anywhere where you can have multiplayer communication can be potentially exploited. It doesn't mean it will be, but we need to be really specific about the surfaces that we're talking about, what harm might come up there, and how can tech companies make proactive policies and tools to get at that. And so, this year we have a gaming and youth working group. So looking at the younger audiences, looking at nihilistic violent extremism, and also allowing tech companies to feed back to researchers where things are advancing. Like Minecraft just recently presented to some of us about how they've built an in-game experience for younger users to better understand what NVE predators might look like. Amazing. Or Xbox talked about how you don't want to disrupt a gameplay space by flagging content to get out of the game that actually goes against the user experience. So you can record what you're seeing and verbally record to moderators what the harm is you're seeing. And they saw the true positive rates of flagging go up exponentially. So having those real case studies and getting researchers to understand that, and then having us exploit where the good and bad and the best practices are, that's where this sort of triage of EGRN joining GNET, working with GIFCT can really have impact.
Yeah, and I mean, do you think, we learn about the contours of extremist groups when we study them on different platforms and the developments, the evolution of their thinking that sometimes happens now happens entirely online almost. Is there something in your experience, at least looking at this, Jake, is there ways that extremists use gaming platforms and games that reveals something about them that you wouldn't see if you were studying them on other platforms? Or are we seeing a replication of how they use what we expect to see on social media?
So I think it's both. I think on the one hand, there is this sort of continuation. And I'm not necessarily a big fan of segmenting things unnaturally. Gaming is just a part of the landscape of many people's lives in the same way as social media is. It's a continuum. But I do think there are a few interesting things to unpick, which are like super relevant, which I think really validate the importance of studying this. On the one hand, there is the cultural component and the cultural dynamic. I think those of us who studied the extreme right online know how important the aesthetics of internet culture are for communicating, for radicalizing, for reaching new audiences, for making your movement seem accessible or you know, exclusive in some ways. And I think it's important to see gaming culture as an extension there. And we've seen this time and time again through different violent extremist movements or non-extremist sort of nihilistic movements sort of starting to adopt these aesthetics. This cascades into the gamification of extremist acts as well. So we see this time and time again in communities who adore and glamorize violence, the sort of use of gaming aesthetics like high scores or score sheets, again, to sort of reinforce and validate that activity. There is then, I think, the opportunity factor here as well. Gamers are all ages, right? It's not just something for young people, but there are spaces, particularly which are hugely popular amongst minors. So Roblox is a really good example here, and those of you who've been paying attention will notice that they've really recently upped their internal security procedures around the use of minors. But here, those communities and those groups which specifically want to target young people, either that for radicalization recruitment or for other forms of exploitation, have that as a sort of a target point. I think the other thing, going back to the culture, to say, and this is sort of what I want to flip on its head when we're thinking about interventions as well. Gaming isn't necessarily higher risk than other social media platforms, as Erin has said, but it is a hugely important and valuable touch point. And I think that's where we really see the opportunity.
Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Erin, about anything unique about what we're seeing, how they use games, or is it more kind of the same?
I think that there's a lot of things that we've turned the dial on for larger mainstream social media that gaming can learn from. But I think there's also tools that need to be advanced and thought of differently. Like even things such as X-ray vision, you know, vision recognition to identify if there's a swastika in an image is really advanced for social media when you're looking at 2D. If you go into 3D world building, it's really hard to do logo finding or the same types of tools. They need to be adapted into a very different landscape. The build on some of those tools needs to adapt. And even things that we think are really basic, like naming policies. In gameplay spaces, there's a big culture of shit posting. I think that's the technical term, I'm pretty sure. And okay, do you allow a player to be named Hitler? Maybe we say that one's easy, no. But what about Mussolini or Capone, like people that are mass murderers? What is actually your policy on flagging to others? Do you need a list of every single shooter in the last 10 years or plus and say nobody can name those? How do you really understand just the culture? Or again, modifying a character. I think where it becomes different is that social norms in gameplay spaces are very different. So my example that I give is my goal in my game might be to rip you to shreds, like might be to mutilate you, and that is socially acceptable. But what might not be is if I'm just standing in front of your character and harassing you in a way that, you know, so I fine to mutilate and kill you, but not okay to stand in front of you and block your player because it's a harassment based on some other thing that's really obscure. So just behavioral signal looks really different in gameplay spaces, and it's game specific. And especially when we're talking about things like nihilistic or sadistic violent extremism, understanding when older cohorts are targeting younger cohorts. Again, that's looking at behavior and network signal or metadata signal about a player. And you mentioned Roblox, who just rolled out proactive facial biometric recognition to try to determine age and naturally block certain features for younger people. These are big conversations about safety, privacy, youth safeguarding in particular. So those are a little bit different in gameplay spaces than what we see in social media or other types of platforms.
You want to add to that?
I think Aaron's hit most of it on the head there. I would say there's sort of other dynamics there which are really important to unpick. So our research has demonstrated that the hyper-competitive environments in certain online games can be a catalyst for a number of antisocial behaviors, including harassment, abuse, which shifts over into misogyny, hate speech, racist activity, etc. And I think that there are these sort of other dynamics which appear on the fringes of the fact that gaming, looks and feels different from interaction on other social media, which creates sort of an interesting texture both for intervention and also for exploitation.
So just to wrap it up, we've been talking a lot about the broad issues, overviews. There's something I want to go back on. You mentioned a case of someone being radicalized on Roblox. And I wonder, just for people in the audience and online who aren't familiar with how this works, and I don't know, maybe you don't know the specifics of this case, but just to go down to the individual level, how is someone radicalized on Roblox? So what's the kind of pathway there?
Well, so there are a few. I won't speak about that specific case where I spoke at the school, but I've got a good example, and this again comes with the caveat: this is before the recent safety measures were rolled back. But the way that would work is you could create your own game, you create your own experience, other people come and play. That's the sort of social component. That's the fun of it. We saw, for example, in Roblox, people creating games, creating experiences which were specifically aligned around extremist ideologies, extremist worldviews. Someone had created a concentration camp, for example, where you could go and role play, where they would drip feed extremist ideology to people who come in. It's important to say that Roblox wasn't the sort of single point of radicalization, though. So you would see people getting funneled out into Discord servers, where sort of further radicalization would take place, further would be channeled into more and more opaque places, these sort of multi-platform off-ramping, which we're familiar with. And I think that is sort of quite key to this, is the opacity of some of these spaces. So if we're looking at social media, if you're a social media analyst, using X, for example, it can be quite easy to generate through native search functionality a list of accounts promoting extremist ideology. You can gather data at scale to analyze it. In these spaces, it's quite easy to create avenues, create pathways which are difficult to track, are difficult to follow, and if these platforms don't have appropriate safety measures in place, quite difficult to identify without individuals who've been brought into that reporting up and reporting out. So,
thank you. Anything final for Mira?
I guess the final thing is that it's really, I guess the bigger question is, well, why did EGRN need to join GNET? And this was a lot. I mean, Jacob and I both sat on the board of EGRN, and we talked through just the nature of the world right now and how a network of researchers can be attacked, how there's not a lot of safeguards depending on where you are in the world sometimes, even just as a researcher trying to point out bad trends and get something done. And I think for some of the decision making that we had discussed on the board was really wanting to ensure that this network of vulnerable researchers, after Gamergate 1 and Gamergate 2, had a bit of an academic institution around it, because academic institutions do have better safeguards sometimes around speech and research, and having it based in the UK is sometimes maybe helpful in this moment in time. So there was actually a consideration of, how do we protect this network? Not only, of course, is GNET about extremism and technology, so gaming and extremism fits well within that nest egg, but also that EGRN was already working with entities like Christchurch Call, of which GIFCT is a member, of which we're all trying to work together. So it was just nice to see that this could come together collaboratively, and that we can maybe extend the wing out to take in other fledgling networks and movements to try to make sure that this research can continue and create safe pathways, but also create that cross-sector dialogue so that these adversarial shifts that researchers are seeing can not only be published through GNET Insight, but that we can share those with tech companies to try to change that and get ahead of the threat.
Thanks. Yeah, we're very excited to help accommodate this. It's going to improve GNET vastly as well. increase our network. And of course, we're going to be able to help do the same for you. So do keep an eye out for developments there. I'll leave it at that. Thanks again, Jacob and Aaron.